Today we want to talk about forgiveness. We've been studying the Creed, and in the Apostles' Creed we find this statement, I believe in the forgiveness of sins. And when I see that statement, I'm reminded of several things. First, I'm reminded of Paul Tillich's famous words where he said that forgiveness is God's answer, it's a divine answer to the questions implied by our existence. And what he saw was that as human beings, we are in need of forgiveness, and God offers that. And this is so central to the gospel. It's so central to the Christian faith. Now, when the Creed confesses that I believe in the forgiveness of sins, I think there are three dimensions in which it's speaking of this, three ways in which it's speaking of it. The first is it's making clear that we're confessing we know that we need forgiveness. So to say I believe in the forgiveness of sins says I know that I need to be forgiven, and I believe that it's a possibility for me. Now, not everyone believes in the forgiveness of sins anymore. Actually, not everyone believes that they need it. And so today you find an increasing number of people who would say, gosh, I'm a pretty good person. I don't think I really need to be forgiven. So it might be helpful to remember what forgiveness and sin actually means. If we think about the word sin, the Greek word in the New Testament is hamartia, and it means to miss the mark or to stray from a path. The idea is that there is a mark, there is this ideal of what it means to be fully and authentically human, what God created us to be. And as we live our daily lives, we find we stray from that or we miss that mark on a regular basis. It may be a harsh word that we've spoken to someone else. It's gossiping about someone else. It may be the times where we should have stopped to help and we didn't. But what we confess in our Christian faith and in our prayers of confession is that we sin against God in thought, word, and deed by what we've done and by what we've left undone. Now, often people think, well, you Christians are all about guilt. You're talking about sin all the time. That's actually not the central focus of the gospel. The focus of the gospel is not sin. It's on grace. It's not on what we've done wrong. It's on God's willingness to forgive. That is the dominant note in the gospel. But we can't really appreciate forgiveness until we understand that there's something wrong, that we need it. And so the scriptures help us understand, the ways in which we find ourselves straying from that path. There's a second dimension of forgiveness, and that is the understanding that God can and will forgive us. And I have known far too many people as a pastor who have things in their past that are so painful, and they're certain that God cannot forgive them. They believe in theory that God forgives sins. They just don't believe God can forgive their sins. Like a woman I once knew who was in an automobile accident with her children, and one of her children died in that accident. And she, for 25 years, she tried to punish herself every day for the loss of her child. And she could not make up for this. She couldn't fix it. What she needed was the sense of God's overwhelming grace and forgiveness. And this is true in all of our lives. Baptism is a sign of that we have been forgiven and set free. This idea that you don't have to be defined by the worst things you've done in the past, but that you can be defined by God's grace and mercy, and you can be set free. There is nothing that God is unwilling to forgive you for when you come before Him and ask for His mercy. And then finally, of course, we recognize that while we can be shackled by our sins and we can be shackled by our guilt, and God wishes to forgive both of those, in the Apostles' Creed, when we say, I believe in the forgiveness of sins, we're also saying that we believe that God is calling us to forgive other people. And what we know is that when we fail to forgive other people, we've been forgiven, but we fail to forgive other people. It's like taking these chains and wrapping them around our hearts once more. And we find ourselves shackled by bitterness and resentment and anger, and we hold on to that. It begins to define us. It constricts us. It ends up weighing us down. And it's only when we finally are able to say, to release the right to retaliate, to say, I choose to forgive, that the chains come off. And I think of a woman who told me that her cousin, someone she dearly loved, had been killed by her cousin's boyfriend years ago, 25 years ago. And she said, day after day, she would struggle with anger and hate and bitterness and resentment. Year after year, she dreamt of putting her arms, her hands around his throat and strangling this young man. And she said, finally, she realized, I can't do this anymore. I have to let this go. I choose not to be defined by the hurt that someone else has committed against me. And she began to pray for this other person, just as Jesus talks about. She began to pray, God, I pray for them that you will work in their heart and life, and I choose to let this go. And she said it was like chains falling away. And once more, she felt forgiven and set free. I wonder, do you know that you need God's forgiveness? Do you know that God's willing to forgive you? And do you understand that God is calling you to forgive other people? And if you do, what you find is freedom. What you find is the forgiveness of sins.